The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of the modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah Mitchell sat at her cluttered kitchen table, staring intently at her laptop screen, refreshing the webpage every 30 seconds as if the numbers might change. The classified ad she'd posted just 6 hours earlier had already generated 47 inquiries. 47. She'd expected maybe 3 or 4 responses from people genuinely interested in adopting a German Shepherd, but the overwhelming response had surprised her. She supposed it made sense. She'd priced the rehoming fee at just $5, practically giving the dog away. For most people, that was an irresistible bargain. The dog in question lay sprawled across the living room carpet, visible through the kitchen doorway. Max was a magnificent 7-year-old German Shepherd with a salt and pepper coat that spoke of his advancing years, intelligent amber eyes that seemed to look right through a person, and a muscular frame that still hinted at the impressive athlete he'd once been. He'd been a decorated police dog for 12 years, 12 years of service in narcotics detection, explosives detection, and general patrol work. He'd been featured in local news stories, had a commendation in the police department's Hall of Honor, and had been credited with discovering evidence in dozens of criminal cases. For someone like Sarah, all of that pedigree and history was completely irrelevant. What mattered to her was that Max was a problem she'd inherited when her mother died 3 months ago, and she desperately wanted him gone. Sarah's mother, Margaret, had been the type of woman who couldn't resist a good cause. When Max had been retired from the police force due to progressive arthritis in his hips, Margaret had immediately stepped forward to adopt him. She'd spent countless hours with the dog, taking him on gentle walks around the neighborhood, researching the best supplements for aging dogs, and generally showering him with the kind of attention and affection that Max sorely needed after years of intense, structured work. The two had formed a beautiful bond, and in the final months of Margaret's life, Max had seemed to understand that his beloved human was suffering. He'd laid beside her bed, his presence somehow comforting in a way that no medication could achieve. But Margaret's passing had changed everything. Sarah had inherited the house, the modest savings, and most unfortunately, in her view, Max. The problem was that Sarah was nothing like her mother. Where Margaret had been warm and nurturing, Sarah was cold and practical. Where Margaret had found joy in simple things, Sarah was always calculating, always planning her next career move, always thinking about money and advancement. She worked long hours as a senior accountant for a large firm downtown, leaving the house before dawn and returning long after sunset. She traveled frequently for work, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time. She lived alone and had no partner, no children, and frankly, no real interest in developing meaningful relationships with anyone, human or animal. The idea of caring for a large dog with special needs was basically Sarah's definition of a nightmare. Max required regular medication for his arthritis. He needed daily walks, even though he could only manage short distances now. He needed a specialized diet that Sarah had never bothered to research or maintain. Most of all, he seemed to sense Sarah's discomfort and lack of genuine affection, which only made him more anxious. The dog had developed behavioral issues, excessive barking, destructive chewing, and an almost desperate neediness that Sarah found deeply irritating. There was something about the way Max would look at her with those intelligent eyes, as if silently asking, "Why don't you love me like your mother did?" That made Sarah's skin crawl. It was too much emotional labor, too much responsibility, too much of everything Sarah didn't want in her life. She'd initially tried to simply ignore the problem, hoping Max would somehow become less of a burden through neglect. But the neighbors had started complaining about the constant barking. The dog had destroyed a substantial portion of her mother's expensive furniture. Sarah had received a warning from the homeowners association about leaving the dog outside unsupervised. Finally, she decided that the most efficient solution was to rehome Max as quickly as possible, hence the classified ad. Sarah had been prepared to give Max away for free. She actually would have preferred that. but she'd learned from an online forum that offering a small rehoming fee sometimes screened out people who weren't serious about pet ownership. So she'd landed on $5 as a symbolic fee that would make people feel like they were paying something while still making the offer irresistible. The strategy seemed to be working perfectly. 47 messages in just 6 hours. She'd already scheduled 3 showings for Tuesday afternoon. The first couple had arrived at 2 o'clock, a nervous middle-aged pair who'd never owned a dog before. They'd spent 5 minutes with Max, watched as he attempted to jump on them in his enthusiasm, and had backed away nervously. "He's just too much dog for us," the woman had said apologetically. Sarah had nodded, not particularly disappointed. The second couple at 3:30 had been slightly more promising. They claimed to have experience with large breeds, but Max's separation anxiety had manifested as excessive barking when Sarah went into another room. "We're really more looking for a calm companion," the man had said, making it clear they were leaving. Sarah had practically shoved Max back into the house. But then came Jennifer and Tom. Their blue sedan pulled into the driveway at 4:15, and Sarah watched them through the window as they approached the house. Jennifer was a woman in her mid-30s with warm brown eyes and an open, friendly expression. She wore jeans and a casual sweater, and even from a distance, Sarah could tell there was something genuinely kind about her. Tom was slightly older, maybe late 30s, with the kind of calm, steady demeanor that suggested he was comfortable with himself and the world around him. They walked together holding hands, and there was an obvious ease between them that suggested a long-term relationship. Sarah felt a sudden wave of relief wash over her. These two looked different from the previous couples. They looked like people who could actually handle Max. More importantly, they looked like people who might actually want to keep him. Sarah had been preparing herself for a much longer process, scheduling multiple showings over weeks, eventually having to accept a less-than-ideal adoption situation. But as she watched Jennifer and Tom walk toward her front door, she allowed herself to hope that her Max problem might be solved today. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her blouse, and prepared her welcoming smile. She'd practiced the story she would tell them, nothing too negative about Max that might scare them away, but enough honesty that they'd feel informed about what they were taking on. She'd emphasize his police training, his intelligence, his loyalty. She'd downplay the behavioral issues, frame them as simple adjustment problems that would resolve once Max was in a home with people who genuinely wanted him. The $5 fee suddenly felt like the best investment she'd ever made. In just a few hours, Max would be someone else's responsibility, and Sarah could get back to the life she actually wanted to live, quiet, orderly, and completely dog-free. As she opened the front door and stepped outside to greet Jennifer and Tom, Sarah had no idea that this encounter would change everything. She had no sense that the decision she'd made to sell her mother's beloved dog for $5 would trigger a chain of events that would make national headlines. She didn't know that Max's true purpose, the reason he'd been trained, and the instincts that had been carefully developed over years of service, was about to manifest in the most important moment of his life. All Sarah knew was that she desperately wanted these two people to take Max off her hands, and within the next few hours, she would come to bitterly regret that desire in ways she could never have imagined. The afternoon sun streamed through the living room windows as Jennifer and Tom stepped into Sarah's modest home. The interior was sparse and impersonal, beige walls, minimal furniture, no family photographs or decorations that might suggest a life filled with warmth and connection. The house felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Sarah gestured awkwardly toward the living room, and that's when Max appeared from around the corner. The dog moved with a deliberate grace despite his age, his posture alert and his intelligent eyes immediately assessing the newcomers. There was something profoundly noble about him, something in his bearing that suggested he'd once been trained for greater purposes than simply lounging on a carpet all day. Jennifer's breath caught. She hadn't expected Max to be so impressive. The photographs Sarah had sent online didn't do him justice. Max was a beautiful example of the German Shepherd breed, muscular but not overdone, alert but not aggressive, with that distinctive salt and pepper coloring that indicated his years of experience. His eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human in its perceptiveness. Tom immediately knelt down to the dog's level, extending his hand slowly in the proper way to greet a dog, allowing Max to sniff and assess him. Max approached carefully, his nose working overtime to gather information about this stranger. After a moment of inspection, he allowed Tom to scratch behind his ears, and Tom's face broke into a genuine smile. "He's magnificent," Tom said, looking up at Sarah. "I can see why he was such a good police dog." Sarah nodded, relieved by their positive reaction. "He was," she confirmed, moving toward the couch. "Would you two like to sit down? I have some information about his background and training history that I thought you'd want to know." Jennifer settled onto the couch beside Tom, and Sarah positioned herself in an armchair across from them, maintaining a careful distance from Max. The dog eventually padded over to Jennifer, who greeted him with genuine warmth and affection. She ran her hands through his coat, checking his condition, noticing the quality of his fur and the overall state of his health. From her expression, it was clear she understood dogs. She knew how to read them, how to touch them in ways that communicated respect and kindness. "Tell us about his training," Jennifer said, her attention fully on Sarah now. "What was his primary specialty?" Sarah launched into her practiced explanation, the words coming easily because she'd prepared them. Max was trained in dual detection, narcotics, and explosives. He served for 12 years with the local police department, and according to his records, he was involved in hundreds of successful operations. He has commendations from the department, and he was considered one of their most valuable assets. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "He was retired 3 years ago due to progressive arthritis in his hips. The department veterinarian determined that continued active work would cause him excessive pain." Tom asked detailed questions about Max's medical history, his dietary needs, his behavioral patterns, and his exercise requirements. Sarah answered mechanically, her mind already ahead, already picturing the moment when they would sign the adoption paperwork and take Max away. She explained about the arthritis medication, the special diet she claimed to have researched extensively, the recommended exercise routine. She was an excellent liar when she was motivated, and she was very motivated to place this dog in a home today. Everything was proceeding perfectly until Jennifer reached for her purse and announced that she was ready to complete the adoption paperwork. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. She was actually going to do this. She was going to hand over Max and never look back. That's when everything changed. Max's entire body went suddenly rigid. His eyes, which had been soft and warm while interacting with Jennifer, became intensely focused. His nose began to twitch with unusual frequency, as if processing something critically important. He rose slowly from where he'd been sitting beside Jennifer, and his body language completely transformed. Where he'd been relaxed moments before, he was now tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. His ears perked forward at attention. Without any command, without any signal from any of the humans in the room, Max began moving toward the basement door, the door that Sarah had very explicitly asked them to avoid when they first arrived. Jennifer's eyes widened as she recognized what was happening. Tom noticed Max's sudden behavioral shift at the same moment. The dog began packing back and forth in front of the basement door, his movements becoming more agitated with each pass. He released a low whine, then another, and then a third, not the whine of a dog that wanted attention or wanted to go outside, but a whine of focused intensity, of urgency, of something deeply encoded in his being demanding recognition. "That's unusual," Tom said carefully, watching Max with genuine concern. "We've never seen him do that before, have we, Jennifer?" "No," Jennifer admitted, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was watching Max with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was analyzing his behavior, comparing it to something in her memory. Tom didn't know this about Jennifer yet, but she'd spent 5 years working in criminal justice before transitioning to teaching. She'd done ride-alongs with police officers. She'd seen working dogs in action. She recognized the particular quality of Max's alerting behavior, the precision, the focus, the unmistakable intensity that came from years of training and conditioning. This wasn't anxiety. This wasn't a dog wanting to play or explore. This was something else entirely. This was a working dog doing what he'd been trained to do. Sarah's demeanor shifted noticeably. The relaxed, eager-to-please woman who'd welcomed them had tensed up considerably. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, now gripped the armrest of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. A faint line of perspiration appeared on her upper lip despite the cool temperature of the room. When Tom asked her about Max's strange behavior, her response came too quickly, with too much emphasis on casual explanation. "He's been like that for weeks," she said, her voice slightly higher than before. "Probably just stress. Dogs are very sensitive to change, you know. My mother passed away a few months ago and Max has never really adjusted to life with me. He's probably just anxious about the situation. Once he's in a new home with people with people who have more time for him, he'll probably be fine." Tom wasn't entirely convinced, and Jennifer was watching Sarah with growing concern. There was something about the way Sarah had corrected herself mid-sentence, "with people who have more time for him," instead of whatever she'd almost said, that suggested there was more to this situation than Sarah was revealing. And there was definitely something about the woman's body language that screamed dishonesty. Her forced smile didn't reach her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her position in the chair. Most significantly, she kept glancing toward the basement door, and each time Max whined or paced, Sarah's jaw tightened perceptibly. Max continued his behavior, undeterred by Sarah's explanation. He pawed at the basement door now, not aggressively but with insistent pressure. He released another whine, longer and more mournful this time, a sound that seemed to come from someplace deep inside him. It was the whine of a dog with a purpose, a dog whose training and instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong, something needed attention, something demanded investigation. Jennifer exchanged a long glance with Tom. No words passed between them, but an entire conversation happened in that single look. Something was definitely off here. Something about this situation, about Sarah's explanation, about Max's behavior, didn't add up. And both of them, in that moment, felt a simultaneous shift in their understanding of what was actually happening in this house. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and measured. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Sarah's face paled visibly. Her grip on the armrest tightened further. "What exactly is in that basement?" Sarah's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, searching for words that wouldn't come. For a long moment, she simply stared at Jennifer, her eyes wide and panicked, her hands gripping the armrest with such force that her knuckles turned white. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and heavy with unspoken meaning. Tom watched the exchange carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as he recognized the signs of someone caught in a lie. "It's just old storage," Sarah finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just boxes of my mother's things. We haven't sorted through them yet. Nothing important, just old stuff." But her voice wavered and her eyes darted toward the basement door repeatedly, as if afraid Max might suddenly burst through and expose whatever secret she was keeping. Jennifer studied Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trained to read human behavior, someone who'd spent years understanding the tells that indicated deception. Everything about Sarah screamed guilt. The trembling hands, the evasive eye contact, the way her jaw clenched and unclenched. The beads of perspiration that were now clearly visible on her forehead, despite the cool temperature of the room. More importantly, Max was still actively alerting. He hadn't stopped. The dog continued his packing, his whining, his desperate focus on the basement door. This wasn't random anxiety. This was a trained response, something so deeply ingrained in Max's being that it couldn't be dismissed as mere stress or adjustment issues. Whatever was in that basement, Max's nose, a nose that had been trained to detect specific compounds through hundreds of hours of professional conditioning, was telling him something was there. "Sarah," Jennifer said, her voice calm but firm, "I need to take Max downstairs for a few minutes. I think a change of environment might help him calm down." It was a reasonable request, something that any dog owner might suggest. But Sarah's reaction was immediate and visceral. She practically jumped out of her chair, her hands coming up in an automatic gesture of refusal. "No," she said sharply. "No, I don't think that's a good idea. The basement isn't safe. There could be. There's old furniture, boxes everywhere. He might hurt himself. It's really not." She caught herself mid-sentence, seeing the way both Jennifer and Tom were watching her, their expressions shifting from curiosity to active suspicion. She forced a smile that looked more like a grimace, tried to adjust her tone to sound casual and reasonable, but the damage was done. Her immediate, emotional refusal had communicated far more than any careful explanation ever could. "Actually," Jennifer said, standing up and extending her hand toward Max, "I think it would be good for him. Sometimes dogs just need to explore their environment. I'm sure we'll be careful." There was a quality in Jennifer's voice, not quite a question but not quite a statement either, that made it clear this wasn't actually a request for permission. She was going downstairs, and she was bringing Max with her. Sarah opened her mouth as if to protest further, but something in Jennifer's calm confidence made her hesitate. To forcefully prevent them from going downstairs would only deepen the suspicion. So, with obvious reluctance and visible tension, Sarah nodded. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, "but be careful, it's cluttered down there." Max needed no encouragement. The moment Jennifer headed toward the basement door, he bounded up from where he'd been sitting, his tail wagging with something that looked almost like relief. This was his opportunity. This was his moment to investigate the source of the alerts that had been driving him crazy for weeks. Jennifer opened the basement door, and Max practically bolted down the wooden stairs, his nails clicking rapidly against each step. Tom followed closely behind, his hand finding the light switch at the bottom of the stairs and flooding the basement with harsh fluorescent illumination. The basement was exactly what Sarah had described, cluttered with boxes, old furniture, abandoned household items, the accumulated detritus of a life lived and discarded. But Max paid none of it any attention. He moved with singular, unwavering purpose directly toward the far corner of the basement, his entire body language screaming focus and intensity. There, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes and an old dresser, sat a metal storage locker. It was the kind of industrial-grade container that people used to store tools, seasonal decorations, or valuables. This one was locked with a heavy chain and a substantial padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in months, maybe years. Max's behavior became almost frantic. He circled the locker obsessively, his nose working in overdrive, sniffing every inch of the metal surface. He pawed at the sides of the locker, his nails scraping against the metal with a sound that made Jennifer's spine tingle. He released a series of whines, not the whines of a dog wanting to play or get attention, but whines of focused, professional intensity. Then, with a precision that made it clear this was exactly what he'd been trained to do, Max sat directly in front of the locker and looked back at Jennifer, his dark eyes locked on hers. Jennifer's heart was racing. She'd seen police dogs work during her criminal justice background. She recognized this exact behavior. This was a trained alert. Max was indicating the presence of something specific, narcotics, explosives, or some other substance he'd been trained to detect. The dog was doing his job, doing what he'd been trained to do so many years ago, his instincts and conditioning overriding everything else in his environment. "Oh my God," Tom whispered, moving closer to examine the locker. "Jennifer, look at this. He's definitely alerting on something." Tom reached out and tried to open the locker, but the padlock held fast. He turned to Jennifer, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to find out what's in here." They headed back upstairs, where Sarah was packing nervously in the living room, her phone clutched in her hand as if she were considering making a call. When she saw their faces, especially when she saw the certainty and concern in their expressions, her remaining color drained away completely. "Sarah," Jennifer said, her voice steady and calm, "Max has been trained his entire working life to alert to specific substances. He's alerting on that locker downstairs. I need you to tell me what's inside it, and I need you to tell me the truth." Sarah sank back into her chair, her body shaking. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, as if to come up with another excuse or explanation, but something in Jennifer's unwavering gaze made her realize that the moment of deception had passed. There was no longer any point in lying. But what came next was something neither Jennifer nor Tom could have predicted, because Sarah didn't just hesitate or deflect. Instead, she did something far more alarming. She suddenly stood up, grabbed Jennifer's arm with surprising strength, and pulled her away from the staircase leading to the basement. "You don't understand," Sarah hissed, her voice barely controlled. "You can't call anyone. You have to leave, right now, both of you. Take the dog and get out of here and don't come back." "What are you talking about?" Tom demanded, moving protectively closer to Jennifer. "What's in that basement, Sarah?" Sarah's eyes were wild now, almost unhinged. She looked toward the basement door, then back at them, her whole body trembling with what appeared to be genuine fear, not fear of consequences, but fear of something else entirely. Something deeper, something darker. "You don't want to know," she whispered. "Trust me, you really don't want to know what's down there." Jennifer's instincts, honed through years of studying human behavior and criminal psychology, screamed that something was profoundly wrong. Sarah's warning wasn't a typical homeowner's anxiety about privacy or embarrassment. It was raw, genuine fear. The kind of fear that only came when someone was genuinely terrified of what would happen if authorities discovered something in their home. Jennifer pulled her arm gently but firmly away from Sarah's grip and stepped backward, maintaining eye contact with the increasingly agitated woman. "Sarah," Jennifer said carefully, keeping her voice level and calm despite her racing heart, "if there's something dangerous in this house, something that could hurt someone, we have a legal and moral obligation to report it." Tom moved closer to Jennifer, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. His jaw was set with determination, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. He understood now that this situation had escalated far beyond a simple dog adoption. Something criminal was happening in this house, and they were witnessing the edges of it. "I think we need to leave," Tom said quietly to Jennifer, "and we need to call the police." Sarah's reaction was immediate and explosive. She jumped to her feet, blocking the path to the front door with her body. Her face had gone from pale to flushed, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. She looked almost unhinged, her eyes darting between them and the basement door as if calculating probabilities and outcomes. When she spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of civility. "No," she said harshly. "You can't. You absolutely cannot call anyone. If you say anything to the police, you're going to regret it. I'm serious. You need to take that dog and leave right now, and you need to forget you were ever here." The threat hung in the air between them, palpable and menacing. Tom's protective hand on Jennifer's shoulder tightened slightly. Neither of them was physically intimidated by Sarah. She was a slender woman in her 50s, and they were two relatively young adults in good health. But the intensity of her desperation was unsettling. It suggested that whatever was in that basement was important enough to Sarah that she was willing to threaten people to keep it secret. "We're leaving," Jennifer said firmly, "and we are calling the police." She pulled out her phone with steady hands, surprising herself with her own composure. Everything she'd learned in her criminal justice classes, everything she'd observed during police ride-alongs, everything her intuition was screaming at her, all of it pointed to the conclusion that someone needed to report this situation to authorities immediately. She had no concrete evidence yet, nothing she could definitively point to and say, "This is a crime." But she had Max's trained alert behavior. She had Sarah's increasingly unstable reaction, and she had her own gut instinct that something terrible was hidden in that basement. Sarah made a lunge toward Jennifer, her hand reaching out as if to snatch the phone away. Tom reacted instantly, positioning himself between the two women and gently but firmly moving Sarah backward. The physical confrontation lasted only seconds, but it was enough to convince Jennifer that she needed to make this call immediately. She dialed 911, and the phone rang twice before a calm, professional dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? Jennifer took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady and clear. I need to report a possible criminal situation at 447 Maple Street. I'm here with my husband looking at adopting a dog, and the homeowner has a retired police detection dog that has alerted to something in a locked storage area in the basement. When I asked her about it, she became increasingly agitated and is now threatening us. I'm concerned that there may be something dangerous in this house. She provided her name, Tom's name, and their phone number. She explained that they were currently safe but wanted authorities to respond as quickly as possible. The dispatcher assured her that police were being dispatched and instructed her to leave the house if she felt threatened. Jennifer confirmed that they would exit immediately and wait for police outside. Hanging up, Jennifer turned to Tom. Let's go now. Sarah had slumped back into her chair, her aggressive energy seemingly drained. She looked like a woman who had just accepted defeat, who understood that the secret she'd been keeping was about to be exposed. She said nothing as Jennifer and Tom quickly gathered their things. Max, sensing the sudden shift in energy and the urgency in their movements, stood alert and ready, his instincts picking up on the stress in the environment. They stepped outside into the late afternoon sunshine, closing the front door behind them. Tom immediately put his arm around Jennifer, and she found herself shaking now that the immediate confrontation was over. They walked to their blue sedan and sat inside with the windows down, waiting. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, utterly unaware that something significant was unfolding on this ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Tom asked quietly. "I know we did," Jennifer replied, her voice still trembling slightly. "Max doesn't lie. His training doesn't lie. And Sarah's reaction, nobody acts that way unless they have something serious to hide." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing steadily louder. Within 5 minutes, 2 police cars pulled up in front of Sarah's house, their lights flashing silently. 2 officers emerged from the vehicles, an older man with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement, and a younger woman with sharp, observant eyes. They approached Jennifer and Tom's car first, and Jennifer rolled down the window to greet them. "I called," she said immediately. "Thank you for coming so quickly." The older officer, whose name tag read Rodriguez, bent down to look through the window. But when he saw Max in the back seat, his expression changed dramatically. Recognition flashed across his face. "Max," he said, and there was genuine emotion in his voice. "Is that Max?" "You know this dog?" Jennifer asked, surprised. "I worked with him," Rodriguez said, opening the car door and reaching back to scratch behind Max's ears. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with years of shared experience and gratitude. "He was one of the best detection dogs I ever worked with. What's he doing here?" Jennifer quickly explained the situation. The adoption, Max's alert behavior, Sarah's increasingly erratic and threatening responses. Rodriguez's expression grew more serious with each detail. He straightened up and signaled to his partner, Officer Chen, and together they approached the front door of Sarah's house. What followed was a process that felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast. The officers interviewed Sarah, who alternated between defensive stonewalling and nervous rambling. Her answers contradicted themselves repeatedly. When asked directly about the basement and the locked storage locker, she would claim not to remember what was inside, then a moment later would say it was just old storage, then would claim the lock had been there so long she'd lost the key. Every response dug her deeper into suspicion. Officer Chen radioed for a warrant, explaining to the dispatcher that they had probable cause based on a retired detection dog's alert and the homeowner's evasive and contradictory statements. While waiting for the warrant to be processed, Officer Rodriguez asked if he could bring Max inside and let him perform his alert sequence again in front of the other officers. Jennifer and Tom watched from their car as Rodriguez led Max into the house. 15 minutes later, Rodriguez emerged from the basement and made eye contact with Jennifer through the car window. His expression was grave, his jaw clenched with the weight of whatever he'd witnessed. He radioed something to dispatch that they couldn't quite hear, then returned to the house. The warrant came through at 4:47 p.m., exactly 42 minutes after Jennifer's initial 911 call. Officer Chen produced bolt cutters from the police vehicle. As she and Rodriguez descended into the basement, Jennifer found herself holding her breath, gripping Tom's hand so tightly it nearly hurt. This was the moment when everything would be revealed. This was the moment when Max's instincts, dormant for 3 years in retirement, supposedly past their useful purpose, would prove their enduring value. This was the moment when a $5 dog adoption became something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. The sound of the bolt cutters closing around the heavy padlock echoed through the basement like a metallic scream. Officer Chen applied steady pressure, her muscles tensing as the industrial-strength chain began to give way. Officer Rodriguez stood beside her, his hand resting on his service weapon in that unconscious gesture of law enforcement officers preparing for unknown situations. Upstairs, Sarah sat in silent defeat in her living room, her hands handcuffed loosely together. A uniformed officer keeping watch as she stared at nothing with the hollow expression of someone whose entire, carefully constructed world had just collapsed. Jennifer and Tom watched from outside, barely breathing. Jennifer's hands were clasped so tightly together that her fingernails were leaving small crescents in her palms. Tom had his arm around her shoulders, his body tense with anticipation and dread. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They both knew, on some fundamental level, that what was about to be discovered would be traumatic and world-changing. The bolt finally gave way with a sharp metallic snap. Officer Chen pulled the heavy chain away from the locker, coiling it efficiently. Rodriguez reached for the handle of the storage locker and pulled it open slowly, cautiously, as if approaching something dangerous. The basement light flooded into the interior of the metal container. For a moment, just a single, elongated moment, nothing seemed out of place. It was dark inside. There were boxes. There was old storage. Then Officer Rodriguez's flashlight beam swept across the interior, and his entire body went rigid. His head jerked back involuntarily, and he made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a curse. "Oh my God," Officer Chen whispered, her professional composure cracking. "Oh my God, Rodriguez, there's—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. What they'd found was evident in their reactions, in the way Officer Rodriguez immediately turned away from the locker and pressed his hand to his mouth, in the way Officer Chen's eyes went wide with shock and horror. Inside the storage locker, barely conscious and bound at the wrists and ankles with industrial-grade zip ties, was a woman. Jennifer watched from the car as Rodriguez immediately radioed for paramedics. She saw him lean over the figure in the locker, checking for vital signs, his movements becoming urgent and purposeful. Officer Chen was already on her radio, her voice clipped and professional as she reported what they'd found. But even from a distance, even through the basement window, Jennifer could see the severity of what they were dealing with. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, sirens wailing, lights flashing. They descended into the basement with practiced efficiency, immediately establishing protocols for a potential victim. What Jennifer and Tom could see through the basement window was a blur of medical personnel, equipment, and urgent movement. They heard fragments of conversation, vitals being checked, an IV line being established, someone mentioning dehydration and malnourishment. Then they saw them, bringing the woman up from the basement on a stretcher. Jennifer had to turn away. The sight was too much, a human being so reduced by captivity and neglect that she barely seemed real. Her skin was translucent and paper-thin, stretched tight over prominent bones. Her hair was matted and filthy, caked with what looked like months of accumulated dirt and bodily fluids. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes fluttering open and closed without apparent awareness. She looked like a ghost, like a person who had been slowly fatting away in darkness until there was barely anything left. As the paramedics carefully loaded her into the ambulance, they heard her whisper just one word: Linda. Linda, the woman's name was Linda. Inside the house, everything had changed dramatically. What had started as a police response to suspicious behavior had transformed into a full-scale criminal investigation. Additional officers had arrived. The entire basement was being photographed and documented, and investigators were beginning to piece together the evidence of something far darker than anyone had initially suspected. Officer Chen remained in the basement, cataloging what she'd found beyond just the woman in the locker. The drug manufacturing equipment became apparent: sealed containers of chemicals, sophisticated apparatus for processing and refinement, precise scales for measuring, notebooks filled with detailed calculations and formulas. This wasn't a casual operation. This was a sophisticated, systematic drug manufacturing enterprise. But it was the kidnapping that dominated the investigation. The woman, Linda, had been imprisoned in that storage locker for 31 days. 31 days in complete darkness. 31 days of minimal food and water. 31 days of being bound, helpless, and entirely dependent on the mercy of her captor. And based on the condition in which they'd found her, that captor had shown her virtually no mercy whatsoever. Paramedics transported Linda to County Medical Center, where she was immediately admitted to the intensive care unit. The initial assessment was grim: severe dehydration, critical malnutrition, multiple pressure sores from the zip ties cutting into her skin, and psychological trauma that would take months or years to address. The attending physician told hospital staff that if she'd remained in that locker for another week, possibly less, she likely would not have survived. Meanwhile, at the police station, the interrogation of Sarah Mitchell was underway. She sat across from Detectives Marcus and Williams in a sterile interrogation room, her attorney, a public defender named Robert Chen, who was already looking deeply uncomfortable, sitting beside her. Sarah's entire demeanor had shifted from desperation to something approaching catatonia. She answered questions in a flat, emotionless voice, as if she were reciting facts about someone else entirely rather than describing her own crimes. "My sister Linda challenged my mother's will," Sarah explained without emotion, staring at the metal table in front of her. "My mother had modified it 2 weeks before she died. Linda claimed that I had manipulated her, that I'd convinced her to change the terms. She was going to fight me in court. She was going to take the house. She was going to take the money." The detective's voice remained neutral. "So you kidnapped her?" "I needed to stop her from contesting the will," Sarah continued, her voice never wavering. "I needed to make sure she couldn't testify against me. I thought I could hold her for a while, let the estate proceedings go through. Then she could be found, and by then it wouldn't matter because the inheritance would already be mine." "You held her in a storage locker for 31 days, Detective Williams said, his voice edged with controlled anger. "With minimal food and water. That's attempted murder, Sarah. That's kidnapping, false imprisonment, and countless other charges." Sarah didn't respond. She simply stared at the table with empty eyes. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police seized Sarah's notebooks, which contained meticulous records of her drug manufacturing operation, a side business that had been generating approximately $15,000 per month. They found documents related to the estate dispute, including emails between Linda and her attorney discussing the contested will. They found a burner phone that Sarah had used to conduct her drug dealings, complete with text message records and transaction details. What emerged was a portrait of a woman so consumed by greed and desperation that she had literally imprisoned her own sister in darkness and near starvation, in an attempt to maintain control of money and property. The drug manufacturing suggested that the $15,000 a month she was already making legally as an accountant wasn't enough. She'd wanted more, and when her sister had threatened her financial plans, she'd made the decision to remove the obstacle by any means necessary. By evening, Sarah Mitchell had been charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, drug manufacturing and distribution, money laundering, and attempted murder. She was being held without bail, pending a preliminary hearing. Linda remained in intensive care at County Medical Center, slowly being rehydrated and nourished, beginning the long process of physical and psychological recovery. And somewhere in that maze of investigation and evidence and criminal charges, there was one element that everyone kept coming back to: the dog. The retired police dog whose instincts and training, dormant for 3 years, had activated at precisely the right moment to save a human life. Max had done what he was born to do, what he'd been trained to do, what he'd been created to do, alert to the presence of something dangerous. Except this time, the most dangerous thing in that house wasn't chemicals or explosives. It was human evil, and Max's alert had stopped it. By 8 o'clock that evening, the story had already reached local news outlets. By 10, it had gone regional. By midnight, national cable news networks were picking it up. By the following morning, it was everywhere, trending on social media, leading news broadcasts, inspiring think pieces about working dogs, law enforcement, and the power of trained instinct. The headline was irresistible, almost too perfect to be real. Retired police dog saves sister from kidnapper, and the adoption fee was only $5. Jennifer and Tom's phone began ringing before dawn. News producers wanted exclusive interviews. Major morning shows were requesting appearances. A producer from a popular true crime documentary series left a voicemail offering $50,000 for the exclusive rights to tell their story. A talent agent, somehow Jennifer and Tom's personal number, called requesting representation, suggesting there might be book deals and speaking engagements in their future. The couple sat in their kitchen at 6 a.m. on Wednesday morning, staring at Jennifer's phone in disbelief as notification after notification lit up the screen. "We're not doing any of it," Jennifer said firmly, setting the phone face down on the table. "Max doesn't need to be turned into a media circus. He's a hero because he did what he was trained to do, not because he wants fame and attention." Tom nodded in agreement, though he was already anticipating the difficulty of maintaining that position as the pressure mounted. But Jennifer was right. Max deserved a normal life, not to become a celebrity dog paraded around talk shows and news programs. The dog had earned the right to simply be a beloved pet in a quiet home. The narrative that emerged in the media was compelling precisely because it was true. Every outlet told essentially the same story. A woman desperate to rehome her late mother's retired police dog had listed him for adoption at just $5. A couple had shown up to view the dog, and thanks to his alert behavior and their quick thinking, had uncovered a dark crime that had been hidden in a residential basement. Not just drug manufacturing, but a kidnapping. A woman held captive in darkness for a month, slowly starving, barely clinging to life when rescue came. But the real focus of the national attention became Max himself. Images of the noble German shepherd circulated across social media platforms with captions praising his instincts, his dedication, his unwavering commitment to his training even after retirement. Animal behavior experts were interviewed, explaining how the conditioning that police and military dogs underwent was so deeply embedded in their neurology that it could remain operational for years after active duty ended. Several prominent veterinarians spoke about the importance of proper retirement care for working dogs, noting that Max's case was a powerful example of why these animals deserved compassionate, thoughtful transitions to civilian life. Max the Hero began trending on Twitter. Thousands of people shared the story, added their own tributes to working dogs, and discussed the remarkable abilities of animals who had been trained for service. A petition started, gaining thousands of signatures within hours, requesting that Max be awarded an official commendation from the police department. Animal rights organizations began using Max's story as a fundraising tool, promoting the importance of supporting retired working dogs. But while the media focused on Max, the human story was equally compelling and far more emotionally complex. Linda had been transferred to County Medical Center's intensive care unit, where she was being treated by a specialized team of physicians, nurses, and mental health professionals. The first 72 hours were critical. Rehydration had to be done carefully. Too much water too quickly could cause severe complications in someone who had been deprived for so long. Her nutritional needs had to be assessed and addressed gradually. The physical injuries from the zip ties had to be cleaned and treated to prevent infection. And perhaps most significantly, her psychological trauma had to be carefully managed. By Thursday morning, Linda was conscious and coherent. She remained weak and fragile, requiring significant assistance with even basic movements, but she was aware, she was responsive, and most importantly, she was alive. When a hospital social worker asked her to describe her ordeal, Linda's words came out in a flat, almost clinical tone that suggested she was dissociating from the experience even as she relived it. "She kept me in complete darkness," Linda explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could hear the house above me, doors closing, footsteps, the television sometimes. But down there it was always dark. I tried to count the days by marking the wall, but I lost track. I think it was about a month. I'm not sure anymore." She paused, gathering strength for the next part. "She brought food sometimes, usually just bread and water, sometimes nothing for days. I thought I was going to die. Toward the end, I think I gave up. I stopped fighting. I just lay there waiting for it to end." The social worker offered gentle words of support while documenting Linda's account. This testimony would be crucial for the prosecution's case against Sarah Mitchell. But it was 3 days after the rescue, on Friday afternoon, that Linda first learned the true circumstances of her salvation. A nurse mentioned that a retired police dog had detected something in the storage locker, that an alert from a dog had triggered the investigation that led to her rescue. Linda's reaction was visceral and overwhelming. She wept, not the quiet tears of sadness, but the deep, body-racking sobs of someone confronting the absolute randomness and fragility of survival. "A dog," she kept repeating through her tears. "A dog saved my life. My sister was going to kill me, and a dog saved my life." The hospital chaplain, who was present during this conversation, sat quietly with Linda through her emotional breakdown. There was something almost sacred about the moment. This woman who had been robbed of everything, of hope and autonomy and faith in human goodness, suddenly discovering that salvation had come from an unexpected source. A dog. A retired dog that her sister had wanted to give away for $5. On Saturday, when the local news ran a segment featuring Officer Rodriguez talking about Max, Linda watched from her hospital bed with tears streaming down her face. Rodriguez spoke about Max's training, about the dog's remarkable career in the police department, about how even in retirement Max's instincts had remained sharp and true. There was obvious emotion in Rodriguez's voice as he described the reunion with Max, as he explained what an honor it had been to work with the dog. "Max is the reason that Linda Mitchell is alive today," Rodriguez said directly to the camera. "His alert, his training, his unwavering dedication to doing his job, that's what saved her life. He's a hero in the truest sense of the word. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't expect anything. He just did what he was trained to do, and in doing that, he gave someone a second chance at life. That evening, Linda's family began arriving at the hospital. Her estranged husband, whom she'd been in the process of divorcing when Sarah had kidnapped her, showed up with flowers and tears streaming down his face. Her adult children, a daughter and a son, embraced her carefully, afraid to cause her physical pain. Extended family members kept vigil in the waiting room, united in their amazement that Linda had survived. And in every conversation, in every moment of reunion and recovery, there was one recurring theme: gratitude for the dog, gratitude for Max, gratitude that Jennifer and Tom had recognized what Max's behavior meant and had taken action, gratitude that the chain of events, improbable and almost miraculous in its precision, had led to rescue rather than tragedy. The police department scheduled a formal commendation ceremony for Max, planned for the following Wednesday. The mayor's office confirmed attendance. Local media was invited. And for the first time since his retirement, Max became something other than simply an aging dog struggling to adjust to civilian life. He became a symbol of purpose, of dedication, of the enduring value of training and instinct. But even as the accolades mounted, even as Max's name appeared in news outlets across the country, Jennifer and Tom remained focused on one simple goal: giving Max the quiet, normal, peaceful life he deserved. They understood that Max's heroism wasn't diminished by the absence of fanfare. His actions had saved a life. Everything else was secondary. 2 years had passed since that Tuesday afternoon when Jennifer and Tom had answered an online classified ad for a $5 dog. The house on Maple Street where Sarah Mitchell had held her sister captive had been seized by the government and eventually sold at auction. Sarah herself was serving a 30-year sentence at the state correctional facility, spending her days in a small cell while her drug empire had been completely dismantled and her financial assets liquidated. Linda had received the house in a civil settlement and had immediately sold it, unable to bear living in the place where her sister had tried to slowly starve her to death. The money went toward her therapy and recovery, and to establishing a victim advocacy fund in her name. But the real transformation had happened in a quiet suburban neighborhood where Max had finally found peace. The house belonged to Jennifer and Tom, and it was as different from Sarah's cold, impersonal space as two homes could possibly be. Warm sunlight streamed through large bay windows. Family photographs adorned the walls, pictures of Jennifer and Tom at their wedding, pictures of them with friends and extended family, and dozens of pictures of Max. There were shots of Max running through a spacious backyard, Max napping in patches of sunlight, Max playing with visiting children, Max receiving his official commendation medal. One entire wall was dedicated to what Tom jokingly called the Max Museum. Newspaper clippings about the rescue, the commendation certificate from the police department, a framed photograph of Max with Officer Rodriguez, and a children's book that had been published based on his story. Max lived in this house now, and it was the kind of life that every dog deserved but few ever received. He spent his mornings on a comfortable orthopedic bed in the living room, watching the neighborhood through the window as Jennifer prepared coffee and toast. His days were filled with gentle walks through the neighborhood, shorter now as his arthritis continued to progress, but no less meaningful for their brevity. His hips still gave him occasional trouble, particularly on cold mornings, but the combination of proper medication, supplements, and the kind of attentive, loving care that Jennifer and Tom provided had dramatically improved his quality of life compared to his final months with Sarah. Afternoons were reserved for rest and relaxation. Max would settle into a dog bed in whatever room Jennifer was occupying, simply wanting to be near the humans who loved him. Tom would come home from work and immediately scratch behind Max's ears, greeting the dog like an old friend, which, in a sense, he was. Evenings often meant sitting on the porch with a cup of tea or coffee, watching the sunset, with Max's head resting on someone's knee. But Max's influence extended far beyond the walls of this comfortable suburban home. The Max Foundation for Working Dog Retirement had grown in ways that Jennifer and Tom had never anticipated. What had started as a small, locally focused nonprofit organization had expanded into a regional operation with chapters in 7 states. The foundation provided comprehensive retirement services for police and military dogs, medical care, behavioral training, foster-to-adopt programs, and perhaps most importantly, counseling services for handlers struggling with the emotional transition of retiring their working partners. Many handlers had spent years working alongside their dogs, developing bonds that were as profound as any human friendship. The transition to retirement was often deeply emotional, and the foundation helped facilitate those transitions with compassion and understanding. Jennifer and Tom had hired a full-time director to manage the foundation's operations, allowing them to focus on ambassadorial work and strategic planning. They'd personally placed over 200 retired working dogs into loving homes. They trained a team of volunteers who understood both the needs of aging dogs and the psychology of people who'd worked in law enforcement or military service. The foundation's impact had become significant enough to attract academic attention. Several universities had begun studying the Max Foundation model as an example of effective nonprofit design and community impact. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the foundation's work was the way it changed people's perspectives on working dogs in retirement. Before Max's story became public, many people viewed retired police and military dogs as having reached the end of their useful lives. They were old, they were damaged by their work, they were expensive to maintain. Better to put them down and start fresh with a new dog, the thinking went. But Max had fundamentally altered that narrative. If a 7-year-old retired dog could save a life, if instincts trained years earlier could still perform with perfect accuracy, if working dogs could transition to peaceful civilian life and bring immeasurable joy to their families, then clearly these animals deserved respect, care, and second chances. The local police department had embraced Max's legacy enthusiastically. Officer Rodriguez had retired 2 years ago, right around the anniversary of Max's rescue of Linda. He'd written a book about his experiences as a police dog handler, and the final chapter was devoted entirely to Max and the rescue. Rodriguez had become a frequent speaker at conferences and training sessions, telling the story of how a retired dog's instincts had proven invaluable, and how handlers had a moral obligation to care for their dogs throughout their entire lives. The police department's canine unit had become something of a pilgrimage site. Officers from other departments would visit specifically to see where Max had worked, to understand the conditions that had produced such a remarkable dog, and to ask questions about proper retirement planning for their own animals. A bronze plaque had been installed in the precinct's entrance hallway, commemorating Max's service and his extraordinary role in saving Linda's life. His photograph hung in the Hall of Honor, updated annually with new information about his retirement and achievements. Max himself had become something of a local celebrity. Neighbors recognized him on walks and would stop to chat, wanting to hear stories about the rescue or simply to pet the famous dog. Children would run up excitedly when they saw him approaching, having learned about Max from the children's book or from their parents' retellings of the story. The elementary school had invited Jennifer and Tom to bring Max for educational presentations about police work and animal intelligence. At first, Jennifer and Tom had been hesitant about turning Max into a public figure, but they'd come to realize that Max's calm, gentle demeanor made him perfect for these interactions. The dog seemed to understand the importance of what he represented, not just his own heroism, but the broader message about the value of working animals and the importance of treating them with compassion and respect. Linda visited regularly, usually on Sunday afternoons. She and Max had developed a profound bond that transcended words. Linda would sit in the backyard with Max's head resting on her lap, and the two would simply exist together in quiet companionship. Linda had recovered physically from her ordeal, though she bore permanent physical scars and the invisible scars of psychological trauma. She'd become an advocate for kidnapping and domestic violence survivors, speaking at conferences and support groups, always mentioning Max's role in her rescue. "I want to help others recognize the warning signs," she would say, often with a photograph of Max beside her on the podium. "And I want to remind people that rescue can come from the most unexpected places. It came from a dog for me." As Max entered his 11th year of life, he remained active and engaged, though undeniably slower than in his working days. His muzzle had turned completely white, and his movements had slowed considerably. But his eyes remained bright, his affection undiminished, and his purpose as clear as ever. He was a living symbol of redemption, of second chances, of the enduring bonds between humans and animals. Jennifer often reflected on that Tuesday afternoon 2 years ago when they'd answered a classified ad for a $5 dog. She'd intended to rescue Max from an unwanted situation. Instead, Max had rescued them, giving them purpose, meaning, and a connection to something larger than themselves. He'd rescued Linda from captivity and death. He transformed the conversation around working dog retirement. He changed the lives of hundreds of other retired dogs through the foundation that bore his name. "We didn't save Max," Jennifer would tell people when asked about the rescue. "Max saved all of us. He saved his sister. He saved me and Tom by showing us what really matters in life. He saved countless other dogs by becoming the face of working dog retirement. One dog, one afternoon, one moment of listening to instinct, it changed everything. That's the real miracle of Max." And Max, the retired police dog who had almost been given away for $5, lived out his days surrounded by love, celebrated as a hero, finally at peace with the knowledge that his life, his work, his instincts, his dedication, had truly mattered.